Good afternoon. I hereby call to order this hearing. Enter the Dragon, China, and the left's Lawfare against American energy dominance. We're witnessing right now a systematic campaign against American energy. There is a coordinated assault by the radical left, backed and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, to seize control of our courts, to weaponize litigation against U.S. energy producers, all in order to undermine American energy dominance. At stake is a lot more than an industry. Our energy sector is the engine of American prosperity, the lifeblood of our industrial power, our national security, and our geopolitical leverage. If American energy is under attack, so is American security and American independence. The campaign against American energy is a three-pronged assault. First, foreign money from entities tied to the Chinese Communist Party flows into the United States to bankroll climate advocacy groups who litigate against American energy. Second, activist lawyers flood our courts with lawsuits designed not to win policy debates, but to bankrupt energy producers and to dismantle energy infrastructure through sheer attrition. And third, the judiciary itself is being quietly captured and brainwashed as left-wing nonprofits host closed-door trainings that indoctrinate judges to adopt the ideological goals of the climate lawfare machine. The first prong of this coordinated campaign is a strategic alliance, a cozy financial partnership between leftist billionaires, radical environmental organizations, and the Chinese Communist Party. One of the primary vehicles for this alliance is Energy Foundation China, which has funneled upwards of $12 million to U.S.-based climate advocacy groups since 2020. And this money isn't going to tree planting campaigns or to science fairs. It's flowing directly to aggressive litigation outfits like the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the World Resources Institute, organizations that routinely file lawsuits trying to block pipelines, trying to ban gas-powered vehicles, and trying to bankrupt oil and gas companies. On paper, Energy Foundation China's goals may sound benign: support for clean coal, electric vehicles, and global decarbonization. But that raises the obvious question. If this is truly about reducing emissions, why isn't China investing that money in reducing its own pollution? China is the #1 polluter on planet Earth. Communist China emits more carbon than the United States and Europe combined. The answer is simple, because this is not about climate. It is about global energy dominance and control. And it gets worse. The man at the helm of Energy Foundation China, Xi Zhao, is not a neutral administrator. He is a former senior official in China's National Development and Reform Commission, the agency responsible for writing the CCP's 5-year plans, coordinating industrial expansion, and steering national energy policy. Between 2000 and 2009, and again from 2012 to 2015, Professor Zhu served as a key member of China's official climate negotiation team, including during the run-up to the Paris Agreement, a deal that gave China a free pass to increase emissions until 2030, while demanding immediate costly reductions from the United States. That was not an accident. That was not a bug. That was the purpose. And he's not the only one. Energy Foundation China's senior leadership includes other alumni of the Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment and affiliated state-run institutions. This is not remotely a grassroots nonprofit. It is a foreign policy weapon disguised as philanthropy, run by Chinese Communist Party operatives. Flush with funding, the second prong of this campaign is a legal barrage aimed at bankrupting the American energy sector through a coordinated onslaught of lawsuits. And if this feels familiar, it should. It's the same playbook the left used to try to destroy President Trump. They couldn't beat him at the ballot box, so they turned to the courts. 4 indictments, dozens of civil suits, fringe legal theories given legitimacy by rogue activist judges. That wasn't about justice. It was about power. Now they're applying that same strategy to an entire sector of the American economy. Over 30 lawsuits have been filed in at least 15 Democrat-run jurisdictions, including by 12 states, targeting oil producers and gas producers and coal producers. Climate lawfare activists have infiltrated American cities and states, convincing them to sue American energy companies. Over 24 pending suits brought by our own state and local governments, manipulated by the Chinese Communist government and funded by left-wing groups. And all of them together are crippling American energy. These lawsuits use creative theories like public nuisance, climate superfund, consumer protection, but their objective is clear: cripple the fossil fuel industry through legal attrition. And the damages are staggering. One suit seeks $1.15 billion. Another demands $3.5 billion. The days of Dr. Evil demanding $1 million are long behind us. These are not good faith disputes. These are weapons. Just in fiscal year 2023, the leading climate lawfare groups, not even all of them, just the leading groups, raked in close to $500 million from U.S. energy companies. That's $500 million stripped from our energy independence. Driving these lawsuits is Shear Edling LLP, a private plaintiffs firm that has filed more than 24 suits. They're not paid by their clients. They're bankrolled by dark money empires like the New Venture Fund and the Tides Foundation, groups that launder anonymous donations into political litigation. This matters because our domestic energy industry supports over 8.5 million jobs that these zealots want to destroy. Our fossil fuels power 84% of our national energy. If these suits succeed, here's what the American public will face: skyrocketing energy costs, a weakened and unreliable power grid, and an historic collapse in American energy production. And the biggest winner in all of this, China, who's paying the bills. This is not litigation, it is strategic sabotage disguised in legalese, executed with precision and aimed squarely at the foundation of American strength. The third prong of this strategy is perhaps the most insidious, because it strikes at the very heart of the rule of law: judicial capture. It is being carried out by one organization with near total control over climate-related judicial training, the Environmental Law Institute and its Climate Judiciary Project. If a federal judge or a state judge is receiving, quote, climate science education today, chances are overwhelming that it is coming from ELI. The group has established a de facto monopoly on climate rating-related instruction for the judiciary. They've quote-unquote trained over 2,000 judges. They claim to be neutral. They claim to be science-driven. But what they are doing is ex parte indoctrination, pressuring judges to set aside the rule of law and rule instead according to a predetermined political narrative. Left-wing bankrollers, like the Hewlett Foundation and the Freedom Together Foundation Fund, CJP, they fund CJP to train judges, so quote-unquote train, in climate science and make them agreeable to creative climate litigation tactics. Then these left-wing bankrollers turn around and fund the climate litigators who will bring these bogus cases before those same judges that they've just indoctrinated. This is like paying the players to play and paying the umpire to call the shots the way you want them. On April 1st of this year, in my capacity as chairman of the Commerce Committee, I sent a letter to the Environmental Law Institute raising deep concerns about this program. We have also initiated oversight requests with federal agencies like NOAA, whose internal documents show a cozy relationship with ELI and its activist curricula. And here's what we've learned. The Climate Judiciary Project tells judges that, quote, the consequences of a business-as-usual scenario would be catastrophic. That's called propaganda. And yet, it goes on, it encourages the judiciary to view climate litigation as a, quote, unique opportunity for, quote, accountability. It even recommends embracing novel tort theories, like public nuisance, to assign liability for greenhouse gas emissions. Let me ask, is this neutral? Or is that lobbying behind closed doors? The materials even applaud pending lawsuits, praising the Rhode Island AG's case as, quote, well-crafted, while failing to mention that similar claims have been dismissed by federal courts as legally baseless. And who funds these baseless CJP trainings? The same dark money donors who bankroll the lawsuits themselves, the same networks that support Shear Edling LLP. This is not how a constitutional republic functions. Courts are not supposed to be laboratories for political activism, and judges are not supposed to be trained by the plaintiff's bar that is receiving their funding from the Chinese Communist Party. What we are witnessing is judicial capture, driven by ideology, powered by money, and tolerated by far too many. This three-pronged strategy, foreign funding, mass litigation, and judicial indoctrination, is a full-spectrum assault on American energy independence. And while China drills and digs, we sue and shut down. While China dominates supply chains, we dismantle our own in court. And while China prepares for energy dominance, the American left prepares to attack our own domestic capability. Congress has a responsibility to expose the funding networks, to break the dark money pipelines, to defund the judicial indoctrination programs, and to restore legal neutrality to the courts. We must protect American energy, not just on the battlefield, but in the courtroom where this war is being quietly waged. Ranking Member Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. This hearing is a perfect display of projection, blaming your adversary for what you are doing. Dark money, judicial capture, propaganda. Oh my, the fossil fuel industry would have nothing to do with those things. The hearing ignores that the fossil fuel industry has for decades benefited from secret funding to wage war on the American consumer by making energy more expensive and dirtier, higher utility bills, worse pollution. Let's examine the facts. First, money. The fossil fuel industry has spent 10 times more on lobbying than environmental groups and the renewable energy industry combined. That's not even counting fossil fuel elections spending. Republican and fossil fuel interests pushed for the Citizens United decision allowing unlimited election spending by special interests. Second, dark money. My Disclose Act would require transparency in election spending. We voted on it a half a dozen times. Every time, every Republican voted against it. Third, energy. Renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy on the planet. The wind, our sunshine, flowing water, and the Earth's own heat are all free and essentially unlimited fuel sources. Their price, again, zero, does not depend on geopolitical events or international industry cartels beyond our control. As Republicans hold this hearing today, oil and gasoline prices have climbed in response to strife in the Middle East. As Republicans hold this hearing today, tens of millions of Americans swelter through a punishing heat wave made both more likely and more intense by climate change caused by fossil fuel emissions. So let's talk about climate change. By damaging Earth's natural systems, climate change costs Americans money. Lots of money. I suspect that Americans would be more interested in tackling climateflation than in unspooling yet another conspiracy theory from the fossil fuel-funded fertile swamp of Republican fever dreams. Climate change is raising grocery prices. Coffee, chocolate, sugar, and orange juice are just a few of the staples whose prices have spiked in response to floods, droughts, and heat waves made worse by climate change. Climate change is raising electricity costs. Heat waves, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and floods raise generation and distribution costs, raising Americans' utility bills. Heat waves force people to consume more electricity. Air conditioners are running all around Washington today, further raising consumers' electricity bills. And then there's insurance. This is the big one, not just because of the added costs for consumers, but because of the risk that an insurance crisis triggers a deep and lasting recession. Increasingly frequent and severe wildfires and storms are making property insurance both unaffordable and unavailable in many places. Texas had the fourth highest average homeowners premiums in the country last year at around $6,000. This year, they're projected to increase by another $500. In Louisiana, premiums averaged almost $11,000 last year. In Florida, they were over $14,000. And those are projected to get far worse. That's when you can find a company to write coverage. Last year, as chair of the Budget Committee, I investigated how climate change was driving non-renewals, where your insurance company fires you after you've been a loyal customer for many years because they can't afford the risk of your property. We found that non-renewals are spiking around the country, up 278% in Florida, 267% in Louisiana, 944% in Chambers County, Texas. Where insurance becomes unavailable, it becomes impossible to get a mortgage. No insurance, no mortgage. Without the ability to get a mortgage, property values crash. Unless, of course, you're billionaires swapping mansions back and forth with your excess income. Rising insurance premiums on their own also cause home values to decline. And a wide-scale crash in coastal and wildfire-prone home values is likely to trigger a larger economic meltdown like we saw in 2008. I'm not the only one saying this. An Economist cover story last year predicted a $25 trillion hit to the global real estate market, the world's largest asset class. Earlier this year, Fed Chair Powell told the Senate Banking Committee that in 10 to 15 years, it will be impossible to get insurance or a mortgage in entire regions of the country. It's already hitting home. I'll share a few articles for the record from the Houston Chronicle. Inside the costly new reality of insuring a home in Texas. Map. See where extreme weather is pushing up home insurance costs in Texas and the U.S. Houston Chronicle again. Texas has a home insurance crisis. These 4 charts show how it's getting worse. How much is your Texas home worth? If you pay a lot in insurance, less than you might think. Wouldn't it be great if colleagues on both sides of the aisle would focus on this, the real danger, rather than attempting to project fossil fuel dark money mischief onto the organizations and elected governments that are trying to protect Americans from climate change. Climate change is going to impose immense costs on state and local governments. That is indisputable. Sea level rise and other climate-related phenomena are already damaging roads, bridges, ports, water treatment plants, and other essential infrastructure. And it will just get worse. One emblem of climate change's costs to governments is the proposed Ike Dike in coastal Texas, estimated to cost nearly $60 billion. Who's going to pay for that? Governments faced with costs like that have a dilemma. Who do you get the money from? Taxpayers? You want to go to taxpayers adding another hit on top of their spiraling insurance premiums and declining home values? Or do you want to look at the responsible party, the fossil fuel industry? To put this into scale, Exxon's profits in the last quarter of last year were $900 million per day. If they had to pay $1 billion judgment, they'd be over it by 6 a.m. the next day. And the oil and gas industry has known about this problem for more than 60 years. For 3 decades, they hired their own climate scientists and did their own research. And their own scientists confirmed that combusting fossil fuels would heat the planet with disastrous consequences for Earth's natural systems, i.e. for all of us. And then, armed with that knowledge, they lied. They denied the science. They obstructed climate action. They constructed the most complex and mischievous armada of phony front groups that America has ever seen in order to do so. The suits that are at issue in this hearing are brought under a variety of traditional state law, tort, public nuisance, and fraud claims. At their heart, they're about who should pay for the climate damages bearing down on folks around the country. We Democrats believe that the responsible party, the polluter, the fossil fuel industry, should pay. So does Milton Friedman, by the way. It's Econ 101 that pollution, a negative externality, should be baked into the cost of the product. Republicans, on the other hand, believe that American families should pay to protect the free-to-pollute business model of their favored fossil fuel industry. By the way, every time somebody on that side of the aisle says the word energy in this hearing, what they really mean is fossil fuel. Every time they say the word energy dominance in this hearing, what they really mean is fossil fuel dominance. It's gotten so bad that the Trump administration actually wrote wind energy and solar energy, which are extremely prevalent and successful in Texas, out of their own definition of energy. They're not just violating economic principles, they're violating the dictionary. That's where we're at. Well, I'm willing to bet that the American people are with us on this one. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, I thank the senator from Rhode Island for those effusive words about the great state of Texas. And I would note that for more than a decade, we have had over 1,000 people a day fleeing blue states, such as those represented by the Democrat members of this committee, and coming to Texas. We right now have over 1,500 people a day coming to Texas because Texas is where the jobs are and you can raise your family safely and with prosperity. The ranking member of the full committee, Senator Durbin, has asked to give an opening statement as well. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Last year, President Trump asked a room full of oil industry executives to raise $1 billion for his reelection campaign. And in return, he promised to reverse the environmental policies of the Biden administration. Big oil, big fossil fuel eagerly took Trump up on his offer. They didn't quite make it to $1 billion for his campaign, but fossil fuel companies spent over $400 million to elect Donald Trump and other Republicans in the 2024 election cycle. It seems their money was well spent. In less than 6 months, the Trump administration has gutted staff at the EPA, moved to special regulations that ensure clean air and water, repeal regulations that ensure clean air and water, instructed agencies to stop considering the cost of carbon emissions, and scrubbed even the mention of climate change from government documents and websites. In our audience today are a lot of students and interns. Welcome to Washington. Many of us have been through your experience. I'm glad you're watching this hearing, because this hearing is all about you and the world you're going to live on. And whether or not the weather you noticed in June in the District of Columbia is going to be weather you're going to notice in May and April as well. That's what's at stake here. They say when it comes to heat in Washington, it isn't the temperature, it's the stupidity. The stupidity of Congress when it comes to ignoring climate change, when ignoring what is happening right outside the door. Who wants to place a bet that the overall temperature on the earth is not going to go up this year over last year, and next year over this year, and on and on and on? And you're thinking about finishing college, getting a job, raising a family, owning a home. This is your world. We can try to hatch conspiracy theories about the Chinese and God knows what else. But the bottom line is, what are we doing about it? What are we doing for you about it? So your generation has a fighting chance to have a place that's habitable and livable. I decided about 4 or 5 years ago to take advantage of the tax credits that were available to put solar panels on your home. It didn't catch on in my neighborhood. I'm the only one with solar panels. But let me tell you the reality of the situation. My electric bill in Springfield, Illinois used to be $120 a month. It's now $15. My solar panels are working out pretty nicely. But what are they doing now with the new bills they're considering, the reconciliation bills and others? They're doing their best to eliminate all these tax credits and incentives to put solar panels on your home. Why? What in the hell is so insidious and dangerous about a solar panel? That was my conscious decision and my investment, and I think it'll pay off nicely for me. Why would you want to set out to do this? Because the fossil fuel industry hates them like the devil hates holy water. They hate solar panels, but we put them on there, and I'm glad we did. President Trump also instructed the Justice Department to sue the states that have enacted laws to force fossil fuel companies to pay for the cost of their pollution, and to block lawsuits intended to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. Now Republicans are trying to repeal the tax incentives like the one I just mentioned on my solar panels in my home as part of the president's so-called big, beautiful bill. Less clean energy means what? More pollution, more heat on this planet, higher electricity bills for Americans. Who's going to profit from that? The fossil fuel industry, exactly. Climate change is real, and it's a huge threat to our economy, our environment, and our way of life. These facts are undeniable. We need you as young people in America to stand up and say to our generation, get the hell out of the way. You're screwing up this planet and we have to live with it. So give us something that's more hopeful and positive. And it isn't by finding conspiracy theories involving China. Instead of holding this partisan hearing to push conspiracy theories and fossil fuel industry funded attacks on state climate policy, we should be holding bipartisan meetings to address the cost of climate change and to identify bipartisan ideas to produce more clean energy, create jobs, and lower energy bills across the country, and maybe give you an earth that you can live on. I yield.
I thank the ranking member, and I would note that both of my Democrat colleagues in their remarks had not a word to say about Communist China funneling millions of dollars to pay for these lawsuits. Miraculously, that was absent from their remarks, nor...
I think we referred to it by using the phrase conspiracy theory.
You did say you don't worry about conspiracy theories, but what is most certainly not a conspiracy theory is that the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party and the agenda of Senate Democrats are identical. Both China and the Democrats want to bankrupt the American energy industry. Both China and the Democrats want to destroy jobs in America, and both China and the Democrats want to increase the price you pay for electricity every month, and they want to increase the price you pay for putting gas in your car every week. That is the agenda of today's Democrat Party. That is the agenda of Communist China. And today's Democrats are not remotely embarrassed to have their left-wing groups funded by Communist China, the world's biggest polluter, because China's interest is weakening and hurting America. It makes you ask why an American political party would have that interest as well.
I would just observe that saying it more loudly doesn't make it more true.
Actually, in Washington, sometimes it does. All right, we will now introduce our distinguished panel. We will start with Attorney General Chris Kobach, who was raised in Topeka, Kansas, where he graduated from Washburn Rural High School. He completed his undergraduate studies in government at Harvard University. I've heard of them. Graduating first in his department and summa cum laude. A Marshall Scholar, he received his PhD in politics from the University of Oxford. He received his JD from Yale Law School, serving as notes development editor of the Yale Law Journal. Attorney General Kobach clerked for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and shortly thereafter became a professor of constitutional law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law from 1996 to 2011. During that period, Attorney General Kobach received a White House fellowship from President George W. Bush. He served in the United States Department of Justice under Attorney General John Ashcroft as counsel to the Attorney General. Attorney General Kobach served as the 31st Kansas Secretary of State from 2011 to 2019. In 2017, President Trump tapped him to lead the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity. As an attorney in private practice, Attorney General Kobach litigated some of the most high-profile cases in the country, including defending statutes and ordinances against the ACLU on multiple occasions. In 2012, he brought the first challenge to President Obama's DACA amnesty on behalf of 10 ICE agents. In 2022, he represented 36 members of the Air Force and the Air National Guard who were denied a religious exemption to the Biden vaccine mandate. Attorney General Kobach was elected as Kansas's 45th Attorney General in November of 2022. As Attorney General, he led and personally argued multiple challenges to the illegal actions of the Biden administration, including obtaining an injunction stopping Biden's illegal Title IX regulation that would have opened women's locker rooms and facilities on college campuses to biological males. He also stopped the Biden administration's regulation that provided Obamacare benefits to illegal aliens. In 2024, the nation's Republican attorneys general elected him chairman of the Republican Attorney General Association. He lives near Lecompton with his wife, Heather, and their 5 children. Our second witness is David Arkush.
May I? He's a minority witness.
In practice, the chairman has always introduced all the witnesses.
I don't think that is the practice, but that's okay. If you don't want to provide me that courtesy, proceed.
David Arkush is the director of Public Citizens Climate Program. He is an expert on the climate crisis, financial regulations, regulatory law and policy, and consumer and worker protection. He has broad experience building coalitions and advocating for the public interest, having interacted extensively with Congress and regulatory agencies and litigated complex cases in the federal courts. Before running the climate program, David spent 5 years directing Public Citizens Congress Watch Division, where he led strategic research and advocacy campaigns and played key roles in the passage of laws, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 and the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008. A Time magazine profile of David notes that he has, quote, advocated for consumer protection, advised breaking up the largest too big to fail banks, and addressed other industry structure issues while investigating the financial sector's myriad ties to the government. David has also taught administrative law and legislation at the University of Richmond School of Law. He graduated with honors from Harvard Law School, where he served as managing editor of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and with honors from Washington University in St. Louis, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. Our third witness, Scott Walter, is president of Capital Research Center. He served in the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president for domestic policy and was vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable, editing Philanthropy magazine and producing donor guidebooks on assistance to the poor, public policy research, and other topics. Walter has testified to 6 committees in Congress and to the IRS and numerous state legislatures. And he has written for and been quoted in such outlets as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. A Georgetown graduate, he served as a senior fellow at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and as senior editor of AEI's flagship publication. He is the author of Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. He and his wife, Erica, have 4 children and live in Virginia. I would ask each of the 3 witnesses to please rise for the oath. If you would raise your right hand, do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All of you have answered affirmatively. General Kobach, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about environmental lawfare. As Attorney General of Kansas, I've represented the state of Kansas in multiple environmental cases in this broad category of litigation. Because my experience is greatest in the litigation itself, rather than on the various connections to China, I will focus principally on the litigation, touching briefly on the China connections where I am familiar with them. I want to jump straight to what we see that's new in environmental litigation. We're all familiar with the past decades of litigation. There are 2 new types of litigation we're seeing just in the last few years. First, we are seeing laws or regulations coming from specific states that are extraterritorial in scope. In other words, the law doesn't just regulate the state and the residents of that state. It attempts to regulate the whole country. And I'll give you 2 principal examples of this. And the main way to stop these laws right now and to try to restore federal, nationwide, uniform regulation in the environmental sector is for either the Justice Department or for a state to sue. First, in 2023, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, promulgated their Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, which mandates a transition to zero-emission trucks on highways in California by 2035 for medium-duty vehicles, by 2042 for all other vehicles. But most fleets would have to meet emission targets starting this year in 2025. This CARB regulation masquerades as an in-state rule, but really it is a nationwide rule because of California's scope and because so many ports are in California, trucks have to go through. And if they go through California for one bit of one day, then they are subject to the regulations. It would effectively create a national policy regulating trucks all over the country and, of course, usurp Congress's prerogative, presumably something the committee cares about here. In 2024, Nebraska and Kansas and 15 other states sued California, challenging California's CARB regulation, arguing principally that it was preempted by 2 federal statutes. Candidly, California was never going to win this case in court. You had those 2 express preemption provisions, and then on top of that, they had to get a waiver from the EPA. They applied for that waiver, but by the time of the recent election, had not yet obtained it, and then in January of this year, California backed down, withdrew their waiver request, and entered into settlement negotiations with the plaintiff states, of which I am one. But not all extraterritorial state laws are defeated so easily. The ones that are currently in litigation are the so-called climate change Superfund laws. In late 2024, New York enacted one, and then in early 2025, Vermont followed. The New York law forces climate companies to retroactively pay fines totaling $75 billion for the past 25 years of fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions. The CCP-backed Chinese-American Planning Council lobbied heavily for the New York Superfund law. In February 2025, a group of Republican-led states, 22 of us, sued in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of New York. We are maintaining that it is impliedly preempted by the Clean Air Act, since it obviously interferes with Congress's objective of having a uniform national law. It also violates the equal sovereignty of the states. But I make the point in my written testimony, this is one area where express preemption would be much more helpful. And I'm normally a strong opponent of preemption. I think Congress should reluctantly preempt state laws, and courts should reluctantly read between the lines of congressional statutes to find preemption. But this is one area where I believe express preemption will be helpful to Congress and to the states so that we have a uniform national policy. And there's language I suggest on page 5 of my testimony. The second threat is something the chairman alluded to, and that is lawsuits brought by cities and counties. And these are all over the country. There's over 30 of them. I want to briefly describe a couple of them. One is Rodriguez versus ExxonMobil. In that case, Ford County, Kansas, where Dodge City is one of the plaintiffs attempting to represent not just Ford County, not just Kansas counties, but to represent all counties in America and all of their representatives. In other words, it's purporting to represent everybody in this country. They are bringing a case under the theory of public nuisance, but they are also doing something different. They're attempting to usurp the state's prerogative as parens patriae. That is to say, the state attorneys general have the authority to bring a case to protect the broadly writ health and welfare of the citizens of a state. So in addition to usurping federal authority by trying to make a national policy, in that case against plastics, they are also usurping state authorities. As Kansas Attorney General, I've intervened in that case and also in a companion case or a similar case with similar plaintiffs going after shale oil production in New Mexico. There's another case that's further along. It's Mayor and City Council of Baltimore versus BP. That one's in the Maryland Supreme Court right now. I think that where Congress can be helpful in these cases is in getting to the bottom of where the money is coming from. The cases have been going on for 8 years. There's not a single dollar that's been won in damages, yet tens of millions of dollars in attorney's fees have been expended already. The money is coming from somewhere. The foundations are getting their money from somewhere. It's reasonable to ask if China is part of that equation, and I would hope that there would be bipartisan support for disclosing foreign funding of third-party litigation. And so, in conclusion, I would say we will continue these fights in court as state attorneys general, but we do need some help from Congress. And I think these are modest requests for legislation, preemption that would preserve the prerogatives shared by both parties for congressional, national, uniform legislation, and also some transparency where foreign entities and foreign countries are engaged in this litigation.
Thank you, General. Mr. Arkush.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Whitehouse, Ranking Member Durbin, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Right now, there's a brutal heat wave afflicting half the United States. Energy costs and insurance premiums are skyrocketing, and we're sitting here in the U.S. Senate talking about Chinese communist conspiracy theories straight out of the 1950s. I don't think this is the right priority. That said, there is a conspiracy here, and it's the obvious one. In plain sight. Big oil has made trillions of dollars in profits over the past several decades, and the industry is extremely harmful. It kills millions of people every year and has cost us trillions of dollars. The industry knew decades ago that burning fossil fuels would cause, in its own words, globally catastrophic harm. What it chose to do with that knowledge is remarkable. Imagine you've learned that something you are doing will cause globally catastrophic harm, will have, quote, serious consequences for humanity's survival. Those are the industry's words. I hope you would stop doing it. If for some reason you can't stop immediately because of the economic importance of your industry, then you could still alert the public and help work towards solutions, including selling safer, better forms of energy yourself. Worst case, you could at least keep quiet while other people go about learning about the problem and figuring out how to fix it. But the oil industry did none of these things. Instead, it actively lied and deceived people, spending millions of dollars on a deception campaign to cast doubt on science that the industry itself knew was correct. They had polling in the 1990s that showed strong public support. and public concern for climate change. And that showed that public support for climate change turned to opposition when people were told that there was scientific disagreement about climate science. So that's what they did, manufacture doubt about climate science and fraudulently claim that scientists disagree about it. Even more remarkable, it's clear they believed the science themselves because they used it. For example, in the 1990s, they raised the height of offshore oil platforms to account for the sea level rise that they predicted. They did this while arguing to the public and Congress that climate science was too uncertain to make any costly economic decisions about it. But they weren't uncertain. They moved to protect their own investments and interests while lying to everyone else. This was all so they could keep profiting enormously. But the rest of us have not profited. Far from it. On the contrary, we're paying dearly. Last year alone, climate-related harms cost Americans nearly $1 trillion, more than 3% of GDP. This is like a stealth tax on all of us. Insurance premiums are skyrocketing due to climate-driven extreme weather. Insurance companies are pulling out of more and more places, even whole states. The chair of the Federal Reserve, as Senator Whitehouse noted, recently testified to a Senate committee that there are whole regions of the country where in 10 or 15 years, you won't be able to get a mortgage and there won't be bank branches or ATMs. This will have devastating economic consequences for our country. A large proportion of climate-related costs are already uninsured, and the burden is increasingly falling on American families and state and local governments. Some of those governments are trying to hold big oil accountable for a fraction of those costs so that the polluters responsible for the damage pay the costs instead of taxpayers getting stuck with the bill. This is a basic principle of fairness, something we teach to our toddlers. You make a mess, you clean it up. Also, the notion that a person who causes damage should pay for it is as old as law itself. You can see it in the Code of Hammurabi, written nearly 4,000 years ago. But oil companies don't like this principle because they're causing more harm than perhaps anyone else in human history. And they don't want to pay what they owe. They don't want the normal rules to apply. They want you to shield them from accountability. And they're pushing for it in part by funding people to spin cockamamie theories about China, like the ones we're hearing today. Speaking of China, if anyone is helping China right now in our political system, it's the party pushing what I think of as a serious energy retreat in the big ugly bill in Congress. Some people call it the big beautiful bill. That bill would put China way, way ahead of the U.S. by strangling our renewable energy, stifling innovation, and locking us into forking over hundreds of billions of dollars every year to the dirty, dangerous, expensive energy of 200 years ago, fossil fuels. The bill could shutter 331 factories and kill 330,000 jobs in the U.S. solar industry alone, mostly in red states, including ones represented by members of this committee. But that's what big oil wants, and that's the industry that happens to fund the elections of politicians supporting the bill and funds a vast network of groups that are still lying on its behalf. That's the conspiracy here, the obvious one in plain sight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walter.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Whitehouse, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of testifying. I'm Scott Walter, president of the Capital Research Center, where we study special interests. It's no accident, as the Marxists say, that China has deep ties to the environmentalist movement. Whatever their intentions, radical climate activists advocate policy after policy that objectively strengthens China and weakens America, whether it's hindering our production of energy, boosting China's energy resilience, or making our supply chains dependent on Chinese inputs. As the report by State Armor I cited documents, the Chinese Communist Party has every incentive to support climate activism in America. Unfortunately, as I also document, China finds willing partners in activist groups like the Rocky Mountain Institute, the California China Climate Institute, and Energy Foundation China. The Energy Foundation scheme is not subtle. It's headed by a former influential Chinese government official and sends money to activists at groups like the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Natural Resources Defense Council. It also sends money to activists in universities like Berkeley, UCLA, and Harvard. But foreign nationals in China aren't the only ones who attack our energy independence and threaten to make it harder for working-class Americans to heat and cool their homes and drive their cars and trucks. Billionaires around the world add to the threat. In Australia, the billionaire Andrew Forrest works with American tort lawyers and groups like the Sierra Club and the Center for Climate Integrity to put a major U.S. energy company out of business through Lawfare that bypasses the democratic process. A British billionaire, Sir Christopher Hone, also funds the Center for Climate Integrity, as well as law-breaking radicals at Extinction Rebellion. Then there's the biggest foreign national billionaire working to manipulate America's politics, Hans-Jörg Wyss, who's poured over $650 million into the American left. Recipients have included Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund, Climate Works, and the minority witness's employer, Public Citizen. But Wyss is best known for giving $278 million to the 1630 Fund, a 501c4 operated by Arabella Advisors and called by The Atlantic, quote, the indisputable heavyweight of Democratic Party dark money. 1630 passes along tens of millions of dollars to the League of Conservation Voters and other environmental groups. Then there's the New Venture Fund, to which Wyss has given $82 million, and which is also operated by Arabella. They run the largest dark money network in the country on either side. New Venture has donated over $1 million to Mr. Arkush's Public Citizen, and it also runs the Collective Action Fund. That group pays the for-profit firm Scheer Edling to sue energy companies on behalf of states like Rhode Island and cities like Baltimore, in hopes judges will force policies on our country that majorities of Democrats and Republicans oppose, policies that should be resolved through the political process by voters and their elected representatives, not by private lawyers and their ideologically motivated funders. Climate lawfare in America is also funded by homegrown billionaires, many with the same last name, Foundation. Hewlett and Rockefeller philanthropies stand out, joined by many more like Ford and MacArthur, who provide a handful of climate lawfare groups $500 million a year. Billionaire Michael Bloomberg supports lawfare by paying to install activists in state attorney general offices, hoping they'll sue energy companies and achieve policy changes they can't win through Democratic legislatures. So far, they're mostly losing in the courts, too. The New York AG's case was dismissed with prejudice. Climate lawfare raises ethics issues, too. Contingency fees for firms like Scheer Edling presume they're taking a risk. But are they, if they have prior funding? Did these firms disclose that funding to government clients? If the government clients knew, did they disclose the funding to the public? Another ethics problem. The Climate Judiciary Project runs educational programs for judges about climate change and lawsuits. One observer calls it an effort by the climate tort movement to brief judges on the plaintiffs' cases with supposedly neutral information, yet the speakers come from the plaintiffs' witnesses and amicus brief filers. This effort to capture courts deserves your oversight. If the public knew climate lawfare's cost and its ties to foreign influence, they'd be outraged. I hope this hearing begins to reveal the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. What we're seeing is not the rule of law. It's lawfare. These lawsuits aren't meant to succeed on the merits. They're designed to exhaust, to intimidate, and to destroy America's energy sector. Death by 1,000 cuts. We've even seen private parties get in on the act. One of the most infamous examples was Juliana versus United States, where 21 people sued the federal government claiming that allowing climate change to persist violated their due process rights. A federal district judge in Oregon actually agreed, comparing the right to a stable climate to the right to same-sex marriage. She was prepared to enjoin the entire federal government, effectively putting the energy industry into judicial receivership at the behest of, quote, children. Fortunately, the Ninth Circuit, by far the most liberal court of appeals in the country, shut it down, and eventually a unanimous Supreme Court did as well. Funded by deep-pocketed climate activists and left-wing dark money, the anti-American energy lobby and its allies in the plaintiffs' bar have initiated dozens of civil lawsuits against American energy producers. These suits, which assert state law claims under dubious nuisance, tort, or consumer protection theories, are properly preempted by federal law. Nevertheless, they have proliferated across the country, and they are exposing energy producers to potentially trillions of dollars in damages. There are now more than 30 active lawsuits across the country accusing energy producers of misleading the public about carbon emissions and climate change. If successful, these suits could destroy millions of jobs and raise the energy cost of every consumer in America. Let me start with the legal foundations. General Kobach, have any of these climate lawsuits brought under public nuisance or similar theories been upheld on the merits by a federal appellate court?
No, Senator, and none of them have been upheld on the merits by a state appellate court either. The case that is closest to a higher level decision right now is the Baltimore case, Baltimore versus BP. It's several consolidated cases. That's basically a case where Baltimore is suing the fossil fuel industry defendants for climate change generally. A lot of these others are more specific, like shale oil production or plastics, but they're just global warming. And the district court in Baltimore ruled against the plaintiffs on all 8 grounds. That's a pretty big deal. And they now are appealing to the state Supreme Court. That one will probably be decided later this year, early next year, but that's the biggest or nearest chance the plaintiffs have to achieving a victory, but they have got no victories so far.
And isn't it true that many of these suits are brought by cities and counties that lack the legal standing to assert injuries on behalf of the entire public?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and that's what I was alluding to when I mentioned parens patriae. That's the state has the responsibility. Parens patriae is Latin, of course, for parent or father of the country, and the state attorney general, which represents the state at large, has that sovereignty. Our Constitution contemplates that states have sovereignty, and they conceded some of that sovereignty to the federal government. But localities are creations of state government. Localities do not possess the sovereignty that a state does, and so while some people may be upset that we have 50 states and the states take different positions in some of these legal cases, the states have at least the right to represent their residents. Cities do not, counties do not, and so it massively multiplies the potential plaintiffs out there, and it becomes nonsensical in a legal sense for a city in one end of a state and a city on the opposite end of the state to both purport to represent the residents of the same state. And in the cases I mentioned, they're purporting to, in a class action format, represent all representatives, represent all citizens and residents of every county in America. So they've taken public nuisance theory to a bizarre extreme, and they've also usurped the authority of state attorneys general.
Well, that may help explain why they are losing so many of these cases. Mr. Walter, Cher Edling has filed dozens of climate lawsuits. Are they being paid by the government entities they represent or by anonymous left-wing donor networks like the New Venture Fund?
I believe the vast majority of the funding comes from the outside funders, yes.
Isn't it also true that one of the biggest sources of funding for U.S.-based environmental litigation groups is Energy Foundation China, an organization run by a former senior Chinese Communist Party official who helped craft the CCP's 5-year energy plans?
Energy Foundation China channels tens of millions of dollars to numerous environmental groups, yes.
Now, Mr. Walter, my Democrat colleagues have said that's a crazy conspiracy theory. What is the basis for saying that Energy Foundation China is funneling so many millions of dollars into these suits?
Well, their own IRS filings, because they're a 501c3 registered in San Francisco.
If this were really about reducing emissions, wouldn't we expect Energy Foundation China to give a damn about the worst polluter on the face of the planet, that being Communist China?
That would be logical, yes, Senator.
And yet, their lawsuits are designed to destroy the American energy industry, which happens to perfectly coincide with the political objective of Senate Democrats to destroy the American energy industry. Would the result of that help or hurt America, and would it help or hurt China?
Well, obviously, it would help China vis-a-vis the United States, and it would certainly be highly problematic for everyone in the United States.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Just for the record, at least as to me, my personal objective is to reduce fossil fuel emissions to the point of safety, which can be done in a lot of ways, including by reducing fossil fuel emissions or scrubbing them out of the fossil fuel power plants, or replacing burning water to make steam with fossil fuel to run the turbines with boiling water with nuclear, solar, other ways to run the turbines. So this is not about destroying the fossil fuel industry. This is about getting the fossil fuel industry to behave like a responsible citizen while it is causing so much harm. On the subject of harm, the International Monetary Fund has pegged the subsidy to fossil fuel in the United States every year from getting away with polluting for free, which is not moral, not economic, not environmentally correct, at over $700 billion. $700 billion. No wonder it's such a monster in the political landscape when it's defending a $700 billion annual subsidy. But more than that, the damage that it does rolls forward. And one of the areas we're seeing it most clearly now is through the insurance industry. And Mr. Arkush, I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. There have been reports, not from green groups, from major insurance companies, from major mortgage companies, from very respected financial experts, that once climate change makes weather and weather conditions too unpredictable, there become areas of the country that can't insure themselves any longer. And once they can't insure themselves any longer in that area, you can't get mortgages any longer, which means that property values crash in that area and that local bankers suffer because their loan-to-value ratios crash and their mortgage revenue crashes. And that the combination of that local economic effect with the property value loss to those homeowners cascades into a full-on 2008-style recession. Could you walk us through that and where we're seeing some current examples of that already beginning to appear?
Sure. That's exactly right. Again, no less than the Republican chair of the Federal Reserve has said that there are whole regions of the country that soon you won't be able to get a mortgage and there may not be bank branches or ATMs. And that is because of insurers withdrawing from those areas. And the way this works is that climate harms raise insurance rates or cause insurers to withdraw entirely. They're withdrawing from entire states. There are headlines about this, every other month. When insurance becomes too expensive to afford or is just unavailable, that dramatically drops home values because you can't get a mortgage without insurance. And if you can't get a mortgage on a property, that dramatically shrinks the buying pool. And also, if the insurance is just really expensive, the expenses of paying for any asset or any kind of ownership reduce the value of the asset, right?
My point in my opening remarks, if the average homeowner's insurance price in Florida is now $14,000 a year,
yes,
and if that's predicted to double or triple, let's say it doubles. Now you go to $28,000 a year.
yes.
If when you buy a home, you know you're signing up for $28,000 a year in expense out of your pocket,
just for insurance.
Just for
not for
insurance?
maintenance
What does that
of the
do
home,
to the
not
value
for
of the
taxes,
home?
not for anything else. That's right. Then it gets a lot harder to sell your home. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And the value of your
Price goes
property
down.
falls a lot. Yes, that's absolutely right.
happening.
And that's what we're seeing in Florida. People are losing their insurance. It has some of the highest premiums in the country. Has some of the fastest premium increases in the country. There's been, according to data from the Federal Insurance Office, there was a 168% increase from 2018 to 2022 in Floridians who have to go to the state last resort insurer, Florida citizens, because they can't get insurance from anyone else. 10% of Florida homeowners already don't have insurance. And more people are unable to afford these premiums. It could easily cause a real estate crash that has nationwide effects, as you said, just like the financial crisis of 2008, which had its roots in a sharp decrease in home values.
And Mr. Arkush, just a last question. If an industry is lying to the public about the dangers of the product that it sells, is that established to be a legally actionable situation? And is the tobacco lawsuit an example of that?
That's exactly right. These are not novel legal theories. In fact, they're some of the oldest in our country. Some of them go way before our country in English common law. If you're responsible for harms, you pay for them. If you can't commit fraud to consumers, you can't engage in a fraud racket. And a fraud racket is exactly what Big Tobacco engaged in and was successfully sued by the U.S. Department of Justice for.
Thank you very much. And State Attorneys General points out our State Attorney
And State Attorneys General, that's absolutely right.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on this discussion about lawsuits, because I think that's part of why we're here today. It isn't just trying to identify the threat as being Chinese conspiracies or whatever it happens to be, but it's also to slow down the pace of lawsuits being filed against major elements of the American economy, in this case, the fossil fuel industry. Sheldon Knight, White House, my colleague, mentioned the tobacco issue. I know that one a little bit because in 1988, in the House of Representatives, I successfully passed a bill to ban smoking on airplanes. Yes, that's true. We used to smoke on airplanes in the smoking section. How about that for a fantasy? And the fact that we had the largest frequent flyer club in the world in the House of Representatives led to a mini revolt. We banned smoking on airplanes. But in order to finally get real regulation on tobacco and smoking, we couldn't do it through the House or the Senate. It had to be done in court. And it was done when states came together, General Kobach, states came together and said, we're going to all sue the tobacco companies. It took years for them to do it, but they did it successfully. And what happened? Tobacco became less of a scourge to public health in America. And the likelihood that young people sitting in this audience smoke is diminished dramatically. Now we have new challenges, social media platforms that are exploiting young people. We've had testimony before Judiciary Committee, and we're all members of it, of people whose children, some committed suicide, others were exploited terribly with sexual images on the screen. And the industry is oblivious to this because they are protected under law under Section 230 from liability for this activity. If we can crack through with lawsuits on the social media platforms, we can change things dramatically. In the last week or two, you probably heard about the opioid settlement, $7 or $8 billion to be distributed, lawsuits. The point I'm making to you is part of the agenda here is to somehow assign to lawsuits some insidious or evil motive and why they're being formed and filed. The fact is that they're doing what we expect them to do, speak up for the consumer, try to bring some justice to a situation which otherwise doesn't have it. We know the fossil fuel industry is polluting this planet that we live on terribly. I can tell you this, a couple successful lawsuits and they'll think twice about it. It changes. We changed the tobacco industry, opioids changed. They can change, but you go to the courtroom to make that happen. I don't think it's necessarily the Chinese motivating us. We're looking for justice, and that's fundamental. It doesn't come from China. It comes from the heart of America, too. The last point I would like to make to you is that we have an opportunity here to do something now to provide opportunities for diminishing the pollution that we're living with. Ignore it, and it'll be too late. We've got to show some leadership in this country. The bill pending before the United States Congress on reconciliation eliminates most of the incentive programs for renewable fuels. And that, to me, is something we'll pay a price for years to come. This is not a thoughtful thing. This is inspired by a president who calls global warming a hoax. I don't think it's a hoax. I think it's reality. And I think we need to do more about it. I yield.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The tobacco lawsuit was, in fact, brought by state attorneys general. And just as a historical footnote, we went to the Department of Justice and asked them to join us. They refused to do it. They said it couldn't succeed. And they also said the tobacco companies have never lost a lawsuit. They have never settled a lawsuit. And you'll lose. Well, as it turned out, eventually, all the attorneys general of the United States of America, including Kansas, joined our lawsuit after a while, after we were successful, because of the legal action based on the Unfair Trade Practices Act of the state of Connecticut, the state of Minnesota, the state of Massachusetts, the state of Florida. The core states that brought that lawsuit relied on deceptive and unfair practice allegations, saying that the tobacco companies were lying when they said our product doesn't cause cancer, it doesn't cause death, it doesn't cause disease. It was a good old-fashioned garden variety consumer protection case. It also involved antitrust allegations. In Mississippi, it was an equity action. It's more complicated than I am describing it right now. But your state of Kansas, I think, is probably still getting money. Every year, every state in the country gets money to combat tobacco because it relied on the good old-fashioned consumer protection statutes that say when you make a promise to consumers, it has to be truthful and accurate. And so I assume that all of the witnesses here support those kinds of consumer actions, correct? I'll begin with you, Attorney General.
Yeah, I do when it fits into the correct legal box. So, for example, the tobacco lawsuits were brought under the state consumer protection acts that you mentioned, and every state has one. And they're based on the notion, which is very clearly laid out, that the manufacturer of a product misrepresents the product to the consumer of the product, and the consumer purchases it and suffers some injury or harm, and it's because of that deception. It's much harder to fit climate change lawsuits into that box because there's no secret about the fact that fossil fuels are used in internal combustion engines and that those internal combustion engines emit CO2.
But the state of Connecticut is suing ExxonMobil right now under the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act, saying basically it's lying about its product and the dangers and damages done by its product. You are suing Pfizer. Same kinds of allegations, correct?
The similarity
but
is...
no one is accusing you of trying to destroy the American drug industry.
No, I don't think so, but I think they're not the same. They're the same. They both try to use a consumer protection box to put the case in. In the case of the Pfizer, they made certain representations about their product, and that turned out to be contrary to the information they had, and the individual took it to direct harm to himself. In the case of fossil fuels, you have a broad public debate about the harms and how big they are, who's causing the harms. You also have third parties because it's not just the oil company.
In court, Connecticut has to prove its allegation, the facts behind the allegation, that in fact the company is misrepresenting its product. Just as you have to prove, by the way,
absolutely,
as you well know,
yes,
your case has been remanded to state court. So you'll have your day in court there, but no less than if you were in federal court, you're going to have to offer evidence that proves your allegation. Same is true of Connecticut in suing ExxonMobil. I don't see how, as a lawyer, you can say, well, the claims under the statute are wrongly brought just because it's a different industry and because there is a public debate because
I'm not saying
also
you can't.
About the American drug industry.
I'm not saying the claims are wrongly brought. I'm saying they have a much harder time proving the claims because of there's less deception. There's also third parties, and also it's not just the fossil fuel extraction company. You have the factory that then burns the fuels. You have the individuals themselves who drive to work in a car. Probably most of us flew here from some point on a plane.
My time has expired. But I could take the words exactly that you've just uttered and substitute tobacco, and they would be identical to what the tobacco industry was saying about our lawsuit at the time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I would note that multiple Democrats said the idea that Communist China was funding this litigation and assault on American energy was a, quote, conspiracy theory. I thank Mr. Walter for pointing out the basis of it are the IRS filings from the China Energy Foundation. I have in front of me just one of those filings, the Form 990 from 2023, and I turned to their disbursements. And in 2023, they gave the University of California, Berkeley, $150,000. They gave the Rocky Mountain Institute $350,000. They gave the International Council on Clean Transportation, which I don't know what that is, but it's on K Street in Washington, $770,000. They gave Harvard University $80,000. They gave the Institute for Transformative and Development Policy in New York, $254,000. They gave the University of California, Los Angeles, $150,000. They gave the University of Maryland, College Park, $250,000. And they gave the Natural Resources Defense Council $200,000. This is just 1 year. You can pull their 990 for every year, but I ask unanimous consent that this be admitted into the record without objection.
Without objection, I think it is important to clarify at the end of the day which one of those groups are actual litigants, you said litigants, and whether the money goes to the litigation as opposed to the activities that those groups have legitimately in China trying to knock down Chinese emissions. It is Republicans who are fond of saying we might as well throw our hands up in the air about climate stuff because the Chinese are doing so much polluting. So I think it is good that, let's say, NRDC is on the ground in China fighting Chinese pollution in China. If that is what they're doing, it is a very different thing than having a Chinese conspiracy that funds a litigating group here in the United States in U.S. litigation. So that's a perfectly legitimate exhibit to enter into evidence. I have no objection to it, but it doesn't prove your point yet.
So I guess you and I disagree in that I don't think it's good that these left-wing activist groups that are litigating and trying to destroy jobs in this country and destroy American energy are being funded by the Chinese communists. And the Chinese communists' interests are directly antithetical to the interest of the American people. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and I'll get...
I think... Actually,
oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Welch came back. Senator Welch, I didn't see you come back in.
Thank you. So, Mr. Walter, I favor the provisions of the IRA that are being repealed. You're aware of what's going on there, right?
To some degree.
All right. I mean, if all the people you mentioned, all of the folks who you indicted for kind of using Ted Cruz's language, left-wing radical ideas, how do you distinguish between a person whose motivation is to be left-wing Chinese sympathizer and people who just disagree with the fossil fuel industry that climate change, in fact, is real and we have to do something about it? Can you explain to me?
Well, at the beginning of my oral testimony there, I made the distinction between whatever the intentions of various folks may be, they are objectively assisting China in its desire to compete with the United States.
Like the Hewlett Foundation?
Yes.
Seriously, Walter Hewlett, his foundation, you think is in bed with the Communist Party?
Well, that's not what I said, is it? I said that objectively they're aiding the Chinese communists, but I did not say that they themselves were communists.
Right, but what you're doing is denying them the ability to make their own judgment about what's good public policy for the benefit of this country by saying that they're, and this really is how I hear it, dupes of the Communist Party because what they're doing aligns, as you say, with the communists.
Well, they give a good deal of money, for instance, to the Energy Foundation China that the chairman has been discussing, which is run by a former Chinese communist official.
So by virtue, does China have any environmental problems?
It has grave environmental problems, yes.
So if there are some Chinese that want to deal with their environmental problems, And we agree that there are environmental problems. And we also know that climate change can't be solved by one country, and other countries start to do something about it. Is that a problem for you?
Well, I have to say that I'm skeptical that former Chinese communist officials are interested in doing anything that would harm their country.
Who are some of the other names? I don't have your statement here that you said are in effect dupes, if I can translate what you're saying, of the Communist Party because their climate agenda, you say, is being funded by them.
I didn't talk about it being funded by them, and what I did explain there are very simple things. Massive U.S. government subsidies for products that use Chinese technology obviously is enhancing the Chinese economy.
Has the U.S. government, through its tax code, ever provided any incentives and tax preferences for the fossil fuel industry?
Yes, a great deal.
And you don't have a problem with that?
Well, I'm not an economist qualified to talk about the relative value of the subsidies, but I don't think that it's remotely deniable that we currently subsidize all sorts of green technology in which China is leading and therefore helping the Chinese.
So the fact that Senator Durbin here has solar panels, does that make him a communist sympathizer?
No, I don't think so, any more than my driving to this hearing today makes me a mass murderer or an accessory to mass murder.
This is the issue I have. We've got a planet that's melting, all right? That's my view. The oil industry doesn't agree with that. They think everything's fine. And we went from a policy where it was all of the above to essentially a policy that everything below is where we're going to get our energy. And what I'm seeing in the arguments that you were making is you're trying to demean and disparage and discredit arguments by people who believe that we need a radically different policy. It does allow for the development of clean energy to reduce carbon emissions. That's what I'm hearing. And then one of the tools is to vilify folks who have that point of view, that they are dupes of the Communist Party that's trying to take us down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And I would note one of the reasons why the left and the Chinese communists resort to litigation is because their ideas are incredibly unpopular when the American people vote on them. So, for example, in the United States Senate, every Senate Democrat voted in favor of the California waiver that would effectively ban the internal combustion engine in 18 states across the country. Every Senate Democrat voted in favor of it, but you know what? The citizens aren't voting in favor of it. They're not campaigning. We don't see our Democrat colleagues saying we're going to ban the internal combustion engine. Even in bright blue states, even in Vermont and Rhode Island, the voters are not saying take away the car out of my driveway. And yet, Democrat office holders are trying to use government power to fight the Democrat wishes of their electorate. General Kobach, let's talk about the courts. The Climate Judiciary Project, backed by the Environmental Law Institute, Energy Foundation, and private donors connected to plaintiffs' law firms, has trained over 2,000 judges, many in key jurisdictions where these climate cases are pending. Is it appropriate for sitting judges to receive climate science, quote-unquote, education from advocacy groups like the Environmental Law Institute, groups that are directly tied to the plaintiffs in active litigation?
No, Mr. Chairman, I do not believe it is any more than it would be appropriate for a group of justices to go on an extensive training conference and be trained in how to dispute or defend the fossil fuel industry. When you have a group of litigants in a pitched legal battle in approximately more than 3 dozen cases, if we're talking about more than just the ones brought by cities and counties, the judges are there to be neutral. And the worst thing I fear going into any case on any issue is if I know that the judge is already dug in based on prior things the judge has done or said against me. So, I don't think it's appropriate for litigants to be training the judges in essentially what their experts are going to say in the trial.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to this as well?
No, because we got limited time. If someone else wants to get into it. General Kobach, isn't it true that... Actually, go ahead, Mr. Arkush.
Well, I just wanted to say that what Mr. Kobach is saying he opposes is exactly what's happening from the defense side as well. The Environmental Law Institute has multiple oil companies on its board, executives of oil companies, BP and Shell, and it has counsel representing them in court in important leadership positions.
So we may be breaking news here. Are you, on behalf of Public Citizen, calling for the Environmental Law Institute to stop training judges and indoctrinating judges?
What I'm saying is it doesn't make any sense to say that they're indoctrinating judges as some sort of leftist plot.
Okay, let's be clear. I'm calling for them to stop training judges because I think they are indoctrinating them. It's interesting you said that, but you weren't willing to go to the natural next step of, therefore it should stop.
I don't know that much about it, but I do know that BP and Shell are on the board.
Mr. Arkush, if you believed what you were saying, you would be willing to call for it to stop. You're not, and that suggests you know damn well what it is they're training the judges, and it's indoctrination, and you don't want it to stop because you want the judges to be biased and rule in favor of these crackpot theories. Now,
I disagree
General
that
Kobach,
BP and Shell are on the board of an organization.
Isn't it true?
Judges against them.
Mr. Arkush, your time is done.
Thank you.
Isn't it true that these programs, often hosted in conjunction with the Federal Judicial Center or the National Judicial College, can obscure ethics disclosure requirements because they fall under judicial exemption categories?
Yeah, I think, Chairman, you're correct. There are definite ethical problems, and in addition to the overarching sort of federal model of ethics, you also have additional state ethical rules that may be violated as well. But at the end of the day, it's judicial neutrality that is the biggest ethical constraint on our entire Article III courts and state courts, and that is the biggest problem I see going into any case.
It's also been reported that the Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court participated in these sessions at the same time that his court was reviewing one of these climate lawsuits. So active litigation, and yet happily being indoctrinated by interested parties in an ex parte sitting where the opposing counsel had no opportunity to refute the indoctrination. Mr. Walter, the Climate Judiciary Project tells judges that climate lawsuits are a, quote, unique opportunity for accountability. Would you call that education, or would you call that political indoctrination disguised as training?
Accountability is the standard term used by political activists to try to say, we want to hurt those folks that we're opposed to.
Do you believe Congress should investigate whether these trainings are undermining the impartiality of the judiciary?
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Well, the funny thing about this conversation is that time did not begin yesterday. And for years, public advocates have been objecting to fossil fuel funded special trips, trainings, exotic locales, behind closed doors indoctrination sessions of judges for like 20 years now. This is a recurring phenomenon. And now we're hearing outrage about that same phenomenon when it's not all fossil fuel funded, when it's a group that has fossil fuel executives and attorneys on its board, but somehow this is the big outrage. So, I don't think judges should be being indoctrinated behind closed doors by special interests. And I've been saying that for years. But the experience of this is that the fossil fuel industry has been at it like hammer and tongs for decades. And now to suggest that a group that has fossil fuel folks on its board is, this is an epic effort in projection and false equivalency. Mr. Arkush, you wanted to say something a little further. Oh, one other thing. The people in America don't want to see a climate solution as a proposition is simply not true. we have done polling that I have pretty good confidence in that says penalties on polluting imports, like imports from China that are built with coal-powered electricity and have huge carbon footprints, putting a penalty on that higher footprint because they're not meeting our standards. 12% oppose, 74% support. Putting pollution limits on big corporations. You can pollute this much and then no more. 12% oppose, 72% support. Putting a fee on big polluters to fix that economic problem that I described, that polluting for free violates the fundamental law of market economics, that the harms of your product should be baked into its cost. That fee, 10% of Americans opposed, 74% support. The problem with this issue isn't public support. The problem with this issue is fossil fuel influence in this building. And I contend that that is what today is all about. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. One final bit of questioning for you, Mr. Arkush. Define for this committee what homicide means.
Oh, sure. So homicide is a legal term that refers to, it's essentially a blanket term for any form of unlawful killing. And an unlawful killing is causing death with a culpable mental state. Causing a death means substantially contributing to it or accelerating it. And a culpable mental state could be negligence, knowledge, recklessness.
So you wrote an article in 2023 entitled, quote, Climate Homicide, Prosecuting Big Oil for Climate Deaths. In that article, you argue that oil and gas executives could be prosecuted, not just sued, but criminally prosecuted for homicide, for murder, based on climate change. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, I would be careful with the wording because murder, again, is a technical term. And definitely we're not arguing that they could be prosecuted for first-degree murder. That's killing with, intent.
But you want to put them in prison for homicide, lock them up, treat them as criminals, put them in, murderers get put, people who commit homicide get put in jails with violent criminals. And your position is this is a reasonable and rational thing that we should put the people leading the energy companies in America, producing 8.5 million jobs, we should arrest them and throw them in jail. Is that correct?
It could be the case that some executives should be prosecuted in that way. Of course, you can't put a corporation in jail, so there are other remedies in that situation.
But you can put human beings in jail, and presumably you'd put the corporate officers in jail.
Yes, you can.
You'd prosecute them for murder. So don't let there be any ambiguity. And by the way, Senator Whitehouse was really eager to make clear that you're the minority witness. You're the witness he wanted. He was eager to introduce you. I'm going to go on the record as saying that is a moonbeam wacky theory that you want to prosecute people creating jobs and producing energy for murder. Let me ask you, Mr. Arkush, how did you get to the Capitol today?
So here's what I want to tell you.
How did you get to the Capitol today?
I took an Uber.
You took an Uber.
Yep.
Now, was that in an automobile?
Yes.
Did that automobile have gasoline in it?
Yes, this is very, very cute. I see where this is going.
So I'm glad you think it's cute. Under your theory, you emitted carbon emissions.
Yep.
Should you be arrested in this room right now and prosecuted for murder?
No.
Why?
That's not what the law holds.
Tell me why, because you're willing to say the guy who sold you the gasoline should be prosecuted for murder. You're the one that benefited from it. Couldn't you have ridden a bicycle or maybe like some fairy dust to get here?
The guy who sold the gas and 50 years ago knew that it was going to cause globally catastrophic damage that would cause problems for humanity.
But you have exquisite knowledge of this. You are saying you are an expert. So on mens rea,
I'm not done.
You have a level of culpability because you claim that the act of getting in that car was violence, it was murder, that you should be locked up. Why do you get to violate these principles in a way that you just want to lock up the person who sold you the gas, but not the beneficiary of it?
That's your claim, not mine, because to be liable, there are a bunch of reasons, but one of them is you have to substantially contribute to the harm, to the death.
Okay,
and
so how many car rides is substantially? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 10? How many?
A single individual couldn't possibly contribute enough. The point is...
Well, what about if, say, you're a Democrat politician?
Do you want me to answer
What about if you're a Democrat politician who flies private jets?
It would be helpful if you're asking the questions. Doesn't he get to answer them?
Yeah.
He gets to answer them in my time, just like he gets to answer them in your time when you are asking them.
Seems like I don't get to answer.
So what about Democrat politicians who fly private planes all the time? People like John Kerry, who say, for someone like me, a private jet is the only reasonable way to travel. John Kerry has the climate footprint of a small town in Tennessee. Would you prosecute John Kerry for murder?
So depending on how you calculate it, U.S. fossil fuel, or the oil majors, private oil majors, are responsible for around half of global emissions.
My question was, would you prosecute John Kerry for murder?
Obviously not, no.
Okay, so Democrat politicians are exempted.
There is no individual...
Democrat activists are exempted.
I'm not going after people for carbon footprints. The whole thing is actually...
Well, why not, though? Under your principle, carbon is killing us. You claim it is homicide. By the way, this is a whack job theory. You teach in law school. If one of your law students wrote this on an exam, any law professor... General Kobach, you were a law professor for years. If I wrote, it's homicide, lock him up, what grade would you give me and why?
It wouldn't be a good one. And part of the problem here is the same problem that the Baltimore judge, in rejecting all of the 8 claims brought by the city of Baltimore, pointed out with regard to public nuisance theory. And that is, it's not just the company that took the oil out of the ground. The individual consumer made a choice to use it as well. She said she dismissed all their claims, rejected their attempt to stretch public nuisance doctrine to cover, quote, the results of fossil fuel usage and gas emissions by third parties located all over the world. You can't put the blame either in a homicide case or in a public nuisance case just on the company that extracted the oil from the ground, because everybody's using it, and we're all involved in it, and that's why it doesn't fit homicide easily, and it doesn't fit public nuisance easily either.
With all respect, I don't think that Mr. Kobach is familiar with the relevant law in this case. A defendant in a homicide case can't defend by saying somebody used my products exactly as I intended them to while I was lying to them about
So you're saying we should prosecute you for murder?
No.
Because you drove an automobile here?
No. I'm saying...
Well, you said you couldn't use a defense. The fact that someone else does it, you contributed. You're a murderer. Under your wacky theory, you're a murderer too.
I'm not sure I should be trying to speak. Can I finish a sentence?
For once, we agree. Senator Whitehouse.
Will you allow the witness to answer without interruption during my time?
It's your time. You're welcome.
Just interrupted him during my time.
You are welcome to sing. No, he was actually, it was the end of my time. You're welcome to sing, or you can conduct poetry in iambic pentameter. You can blow a kazoo. You can do whatever you wish.
Go ahead and answer the question that you were
thank you. I'm a little lost now as to where we were, but my point was that a fossil fuel producer in a criminal trial would not be able to say... I mean, there's legal doctrine on this, right? You can say there's an intervening third party, intervening circumstances that disrupt the chain of causation. You cannot say that when the third party, their actions were completely foreseeable. Like, for example, a consumer using your product exactly as you intended. You also can't use it when you defrauded them into using your product exactly as you intended. So,
that is
with all respect, the Baltimore judge is wrong.
The company can't use that defense.
Sorry?
The company can't use that defense
right.
when it is on the delivery end of the fraud.
It's meritless in a criminal context anyway.
Yeah. And the tobacco case focused on key organizations, not everybody who smoked and gave secondhand smoke. Lawyers know how to sort through this stuff. And I think that we really do have to take the harm that is being caused by these companies and protected behind the $700 billion a year annual subsidy that Congress showers them with every year, and that motivates them to be so influential and so intrusive into Congress, so involved in elections, spending so many millions of dollars in dark money and in direct money. And in the meantime, just to use the very simplest example of the articles I put into the record, here comes an insurance crisis that's already fully engaged in Florida, that is hitting southern Mississippi, southern Louisiana, southern Texas, It's hitting all the coastal states as predicted by the chief economist of Freddie Mac, not a green group, not a Chinese communist group, as predicted by that chief economist, as predicted by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, far from green, as predicted by the CEO of American Aon, as predicted by the board of Allianz, the biggest insurance company on the planet. You can make as much fun as you like of an article that Mr. Arkush wrote, but that doesn't take away from the fundamental fact that the Earth's natural systems are being badly degraded by fossil fuel, and that the fossil fuel industry knew that this would happen, and that for years, knowing that it would happen, they lied about it. They set up whole organizations to lie about it even more. They fund an entire armada of front groups whose job is to lie about it. And I do believe that it's proper to hold a corporation accountable for that kind of misconduct. Mr. Arkush.
Hey, there are two things I'd like to say. One, it does seem like we can all agree on one thing, which is that groups spending money to influence other people's behavior can be problematic. And sometimes people don't do things for the right reasons. They do things because they're getting paid, right? And there is almost nobody in the world with more resources than the fossil fuel industry to be paying people to do their bidding. And I think it's just important to note that. As Senator Whitehouse noted, one of them alone, ExxonMobil last year, almost $1 billion in profits a day. Every day, that's more than twice the amount that was on that chart that you held up, Mr. Chairman, for all the environmental groups. So, right, ExxonMobil, twice that amount every single day. That's just one of the oil companies. I'm very concerned about spending money on political influence, and it's a lot more on that side. Second, I just want to say, my understanding of this theory about China is that, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that China is ahead of the US right now in manufacturing some aspects of renewable energy, right? Solar panels, batteries, ahead on critical minerals, right? And I guess the theory is, therefore they want to stifle our fossil fuels so that we're dependent on them for their renewable energy. I don't know why they'd want to stifle fossil fuels when China is like a huge buyer of US oil and gas. Some of it they burn, some of it they flip. They flip a lot of the oil and gas at a profit. If we are losing a competition with China on the technologies of tomorrow, we should be investing in those technologies and funding them, right? Imagine in the late 50s and early 60s when we were worried we were losing the space race with the Soviet Union. Imagine if instead of saying, in 1962, Kennedy saying, we're going to go to the moon by the end of this decade, he said, you know what? We're going to defund all of aeronautics and stay on the ground. Is that the way to make America strong and great? I don't think so. And I wish that you would all join the people who are trying to make America strong and great today and tomorrow by funding the industries and the energy sources of tomorrow that are cleaner, safer, and cheaper, like renewables.
Thank you to each of the witnesses. A final question, Mr. Walter, you're an expert on special interests. When it comes to dark money political funding, where is more of it found, on the left or on the right? What are the biggest funders?
It's considerably more on the left, depending on how you want to define dark money. Oddly enough, people who use the term a lot tend not to define it with any legal precision. But the largest of any such entity, left or right, again, is the vast multi-billion-dollar network run by Arabella Advisors with hundreds of millions of dollars from the foreign billionaire, Mr. Weiss.
And oddly enough, my Democrat colleagues never seem concerned by that massive money on the left, which is considerably larger than the money that is supporting Republicans.
Again, since you're speaking about me, that's also not true. I am the actual lead sponsor of an act that would end dark money, and it wouldn't end it just on your side. It would end it for everyone. Everyone would know who is funding people's campaigns. And every Democrat votes for that bill to get rid of dark money, and every Republican votes against that bill to protect dark money, largely because the fossil fuel industry's dark money is the lifeblood of the Republican political operation. You don't want to see that exposed.
So that happens to be factually false, but I'll point out every year I've been in the Senate, I've introduced legislation called the Super PAC Elimination Act that does two very simple things. One, it allows unlimited individual contributions directly to federal campaigns, as is the case in state law in many states, including my home state of Texas. And two, it requires immediate 24-hour disclosure of any contributions. As a practical matter, super PACs would go away. And every time we've tried to vote on that, the Democrats uniformly oppose it. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here. This concludes our hearing. Written questions can be submitted for the record until Wednesday, July 2nd at 5 p.m., and I will ask the witnesses to answer and return the questions to the committee by July 16th at 5 p.m. This hearing is adjourned.